as you mentioned, the Russian economy, it's never been stronger since the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, we've seen it since the war began just 3 years ago this month. The Russian economy has shot up from the sixth largest in the world through in terms of purchase power parity to the fourth largest, ahead of Germany and Japan. And I don't think anyone saw that coming. But obviously, U.S. sanctions and their proxy war in Ukraine against Russia has had no effect. If anything, it's backfired on the U.S. both in terms of making Russia stronger economically and much more, especially militarily.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I've got again David Pyne with me, who's a former US Army officer and currently serves as the Deputy Director for the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. He also publishes on a popular Substack called The Real War, on which he analyzes international affairs and US national politics. Today, I want to discuss with David the first couple of tumultuous days of the Trump administration and where the peace negotiations might stand at the moment. So, David, welcome.
Thanks, Pascal. It's great to be on.
David, you've been watching the Trump campaign very closely. You were at the at the Republican National Congress, right? When Trump basically got endorsed, and ever from there, you've been following really closely. One of the things that Donald Trump promised from the very beginning is that he would end the war in Ukraine on day one in 24 hours. And my mother, my dear mother, the other day asked me, "Isn't that day over by now?" It kind of is, isn't it? So this is like around the world. I just want to say that message was received. Where are the peace negotiations standing? What's your interpretation of why there has been no meeting yet?
Well, it's a little perplexing, to be honest, but let me just start by saying, President Trump has demonstrated the ability to end wars in a day, essentially. I mean, he ended the Gaza conflict, at least with the ceasefire, which we hope is going to be permanent, providing we can get past phase one. That may depend on the discussions with Netanyahu at the White House today. And he has the same capability to do so in Ukraine, with regards to ending the war there. And the reason I say that is the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation at the United Nations recently stated in a podcast that Trump could do that in a day because Russia's ready to end the war. They've been ready to end the war, and all he would need to do is essentially provide a framework that accepts, four or five of their major points, and they'd be willing to, start the ceasefire, pretty much immediately. With regards to Zelensky, that's it's going to take more pressure because he has been, more recalcitrant in terms of, lifting his ban on the ban on peace negotiations with the Russian Federation. But essentially, all he'd need to do is to, threaten him to end his access to Starlink, and that would happen immediately as well. So, in answer to your question, there's two conflicting factions within the Trump administration. I think that's pretty normal. We saw it to a lesser extent in the Biden administration that the Atlanticist, wing of the Biden administration was much more dominant. But in the Trump administration, the factions, between the neocon faction and the America First nationalist faction, conservative faction, are actually fairly evenly matched. And so that's why, just yesterday we saw a restoration of the, arms shipments to Ukraine, which we thought were, part of the 90-day suspension. Actually, they were until they weren't. So I think that Trump is getting some bad advice from the neocons, suggesting that it needs to be drawn out. It needs to be 100 days. I think Trump said 6 months, and then Keith Kellogg, former lieutenant or retired lieutenant general, stated that He could maybe do it in 100 days, and then we had a potential 100-day peace plan that was leaked. But Trump has stated, he's publicly stated from the Oval Office that serious talks are already underway with the Russians, and then we hear from the Russians that we're still waiting for a phone call. But yes, there's been limited talks at the embassy level. The problem is that there's no current Russian ambassador in the United States. Russia, of course, would call their ambassador home in October. I don't recall the exact reason for that, but they haven't sent a new ambassador. I think they've submitted a name for approval for the U.S. To resend an ambassador. But if that's the case, any ambassador level discussions would have to be embassy discussions would either be at a lower level at the Russian embassy, or they would be with the Biden appointed ambassador in Moscow. So it has been frustrating for me as well, not to see immediate progress. But at the same time, just listening to the rhetoric coming out from the president, from the Trump administration, even from his neocon appointees, it's so much more, it's refreshing because they keep, Rubio keeps talking about the need to end the war, to save Ukraine, that they've basically lost the war. All these admissions of truth you never would have imagined or coming out of the Biden administration.
Which is surprising because Marco Rubio, traditionally, I would have looked at him as part of the neocon faction, not as part of the kind of realist, let's stop this lost cause kind of approach. But at the same time, though, one thing that worried a lot of us, especially right after Donald Trump came into the office, is that he made a couple of statements that seemed very much out of touch with what is happening on the front lines, or what we know that is happening on the front lines from all of the Telegram channels and all of the all of the firsthand or almost firsthand reports that we are getting from these various observers, which is like, we know that right now Ukraine has never been in a weaker position. We know right now that even people like Mr. Budanov in Ukraine are apparently, this one has not been confirmed, but apparently talking about Ukraine having maximally a couple of months left, and we now hear how the front lines are really crumbling, and the Russians have never moved faster, right? And at the same time, Mr. Trump has said that Russia is suffering and the economy is suffering and so on, things that just seem very much out of touch. So is that part of this bad advice as you're seeing it? Or I have one more issue, which is that his nominations aren't through yet. All of his appointees, especially people, very pivotal people like Tulsi Gabbard, and by the time he made that appointment, that statement, also Kennedy was not through yet. Do you think that there's some scheming going on, as in, making sure that his cabinet is in place before actually starting the what he promised that he would do? And funnily enough, so far he has been doing a lot of the stuff that has been promising to do, even though it's like now in full swing.
I don't think there's any plan to wait for the cabinet heads to be in place. I think he's moving forward, in pretty much every issue that he's promised to do. Some at a slower pace than others, some at a much faster pace than we expected, as I think we'll discuss later in the program. But yes, the statements that he made regarding Russia having 1 million deaths in the war. I mean, we know it's 100,000 max, could be less. That Russia suffered many more casualties than Ukraine. That's completely false. They've likely suffered four times less due to their superiority and supremacy in terms of artillery systems, combat drones, missiles, air power, etc. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, the Russian economy, it's never been stronger since the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, we've seen it since the war began just 3 years ago this month. The Russian economy has shot up from the sixth largest in the world through in terms of purchase power parity to the fourth largest, ahead of Germany and Japan. And I don't think anyone saw that coming. But obviously, U.S. sanctions and their proxy war in Ukraine against Russia has had no effect. If anything, it's backfired on the U.S. both in terms of making Russia stronger economically and much more, especially militarily. So yeah, I've been doing what I can to my end. I received word yesterday that I was successful in getting a copy of my peace plan through to an incoming member of the Trump cabinet. I've also been involved in trying to help Tulsi Gabbard get confirmed behind the scenes, working with one of my senators. So I think we're making progress. I think if we get Tulsi Gabbard appointed to, as Director of National Intelligence, she's going to be briefing the president every day. It's usually the CIA director that does that, but she'll be providing the presidential daily brief every day. And if he asks questions about it, she's going to provide, pretty good answers. I don't agree with her on everything, but certainly in terms of war, World War avoidance, I think she and I are, in lockstep in terms of our determination to avoid war with Russia and China. And I think that's the president's, primary overriding directive as well.
So do you think that it's simply the case that he has currently other priorities and there are theories around that he's trying to that this is probably basically a negotiation tactic that President Trump would actually want the Russians to reach out to him first and not him directly to them. So in order to strengthen your hand, is that something that you think is plausible? Because it's the problem is the longer he waits with actually getting negotiations going, the weaker the hand because Ukraine is falling apart. So every day that negotiations don't start are days lost that are actually going to be in favor of Russia then being able to impose like a military solution, at least more than what it would have been like a couple of months ago.
Well, that's an excellent point, and I argued pretty much that as well in one of my last articles, in which I stated that Russia is racing. They're racing to grab control of as much territory as possible before the ceasefire. So that, as you mentioned, the best way to support Ukraine, if anyone's really serious about supporting Ukraine and saving Ukraine, preventing them from losing any additional territory, we know that it's the line of control that's going to be the dividing line. So the line of control today is going to be much more favorable for Ukraine, especially in the Donbass region, than it will be in 3 months. The leaked timeline that was provided by Ukrainian media organization and covered by Newsweek that I reported on, stated that April 20th is the planned date for a ceasefire. So again, that's 2.5 months plus ahead of us. So based on my analysis, Ukraine has been losing about 100,000 casualties every 3 months. So we're talking about, 80, 90,000 Ukrainians killed and wounded that we could save, that Trump could save by imposing a ceasefire today and telling Zelensky, you better agree to the ceasefire or we'll drop Starlink access and then you won't, you know, I mean, they literally could not have continued the war without Starlink. If Starlink had not been granted, access to Ukraine, the war would have been ended in April of 2022 with the Istanbul Agreement, even with the Russian military withdrawal, unilateral withdrawal from northern Ukraine.
Right, but the issue though is that a ceasefire cannot be mandated from the US side alone, right? You actually need the buy-in of the Russians, and one of the clear one of the things that have been like clear now for at least the last 6 to 12 months is that Russia demands these four territories, right? And they do not control them completely yet. So even if the Ukrainians stopped shooting, the Russians would demand that they withdraw to the territorial borders of the oblasts. Is that something that you can imagine that the United States, that Mr. Trump might be willing to do and say like, okay, this is it. You've got to fall back, and we're not giving you the Starlink access or whatever it is, the access that it is that you need in order to keep going. Plus, maybe are you not afraid that we might be underestimating the Ukrainians after all? That they would just say like no and fight on with the guerrilla warfare that they would be able to do?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think Ukraine really has the capability to fight without U.S. assistance, both economic, military assistance, in terms of intelligence assistance. I mean, it's been widely reported, certainly on the Russian side, that any missiles with the 50-mile range or beyond, Ukraine can't even target them without U.S. Satellite tracking, targeting information. So we withdraw that, and they have no long range capabilities. We withdraw Starlink. They can't even coordinate above the company level. There'd be no counteroffensives. There'd be no offensives. I mean, uh, the Ukrainian, literally the front lines would collapse quite quickly within a matter of days or weeks without Starlink. So yeah, I mean, could they keep fighting a guerrilla war? Yes, they could, but in answer to your other question, with if President Trump were to decide to try to pressure Ukraine to accept Putin's June 14th peace offer terms, then he could do that. I think that Ukraine would be forced to comply, but I don't think that's in the U.S. interest. I don't think it's necessary. I've always been believed that Putin's June 14th peace offer was a really negotiating tactic. Essentially, that he would be willing to. It would show that he was making concessions with President Trump. That if he would give that up, and that would give President Trump kind of an ability to paint any subsequent peace agreement as a win because he forced Putin to back down on his claim of all of the four oblasts along their constitutional borders. So, and I think what I've heard from the Russian side is that they are willing to accept the line of control as it's currently outlined, with the exception, of course, of territorial exchanges in Kursk, where Ukrainians would be forced to withdraw from Kursk, all of Russian territory, pre-war territory, and then Russia would be willing to withdraw from their occupied areas in Kharkiv and Mykolaiv. So I think that's a good solution. It's a workable compromise solution that I think would be acceptable to both sides, and I think it could be included in a framework agreement that would need to precede a ceasefire.
What is the reason that make for you to believe that Russia uses the four oblast talking point as a bargaining chip? Because to me, they always seemed like very serious about this because they even incorporated those oblasts like legally into their under their constitution, into the legal framework. I mean, that's a pretty heavy
Sure.
one, pretty heavy. So why do you think that this is actually up to for negotiation?
Well, at the time that Putin issued the decree, and which was approved, of course, by the Russian Duma, to annex the four regions, the question was laid to him, what are the borders? What are the borders of the oblast? And essentially, the reply was, it's still yet to be decided. So it indicated flexibility in what those borders could be. So the first time we heard otherwise was June 14th. So that is the standing. You're correct. That's the standing peace proposal on the table from the Russian side. So they've modified the terms, just as you and I predicted. The terms of peace from the Russian side are getting worse and worse as the war goes on. As the Russian military, which as late as at the end of 2022 was outnumbered in Ukraine by 3-1 in terms of Ukrainian troops to Russian troops, and now has a 2-1 superiority. And that's what's so entertaining is Ukraine or Zelensky recently claimed that Ukrainian troop levels are at 880,000 and Russian troop levels are only at 600,000. And yet for all the frontline reports we're getting from the regime media here in the US and even on the UK side are telling a different tale that some battalions are down to two infantrymen, 10% strength, commanded by senior lieutenants instead of lieutenant colonels. And it's just a massive manpower shortage. People in Ukrainian troops are interviewed at the front and and they just talk about how Russia has so many troops and we don't have enough infantrymen.
Yeah, I
So
mean, Ukraine we wouldn't have a discussion about lowering the recruitment age, the draft age from currently 25 down to 18 if there was not a serious problem of shortages. I mean, that one is indisputable unless you belong to the media industrial complex, in which case you constantly pretend that reality, the fantasy land is reality. But that's an interesting thought that you gave there. That actually the definition in the constitution of the four new oblasts might not be strictly written down. It might we could try to check that and see if there's room for interpretation, which would give room for negotiation space. You're absolutely right. But um, let me ask though, the other key points of the peace proposal, also of the negotiation plan that you laid out, what are those? I mean, the neutrality of the rest of Ukraine is out of the question, right? As in that has to happen, right? That's a non-negotiable point, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Yeah, I previously said we could maybe compromise with major non-NATO ally status. But that was really a sop to the Biden administration because I knew that the entire reason they were fighting that war was to preserve the military alignment of Ukraine with the West, continuing to make it essentially a U.S. satellite. But with neutrality, of course, would change that. Would change that equation. Ukraine would return to being a neutral buffer state between Ukraine and between NATO and Russia that would protect both sides from each other, provide security to Ukraine. Because as we know, the first 14 years of Putin's presidency in Russia were marked by, no aggression. No, there was no Russian aggression against Ukraine. Ukraine was in control of 100% of its territory, so long as, before the Maidan coup, which overthrew Yanukovych as the democratically elected president of Ukraine. With him, during his presidency, he was committed to neutrality because neutrality was stated in the Ukrainian Declaration of Independence, and it's also was stated in the Constitution prior to 2019. Yeah, that's the first point. The second point is the oblast has to be a line of control. Russia's not going to give up any territory. Ukraine doesn't have to recognize the annexations, but they have to recognize essentially indefinite Russian control. And then, the next other points are, of course, the DMZ. The DMZ really is optional. I think it would be useful to have, a Korean style demilitarized zone. I don't think it necessarily has to have peacekeepers. The DMZ in Korea does not have any international peacekeepers, but if it did have any peacekeepers, they should be from the non-aligned movement because Russia has made clear they're not going to accept UN peacekeepers. They're not going to accept OSCE peacekeepers. Actually, they said no foreign troops at all in Ukraine. And that's out of concern that they'd be, Western allied or Western backed. And while there are, two or three Western allies, nominal allies, in the non-aligned movement, we could have the force led by India, which has very good relations with the Russian Federation, so to allay any of their concerns in that regard.
One thing that I wonder is like why the discussion about peacekeepers at all? Because the arrangement in the Donbass before was not having peacekeepers there, was having observers there from the OSCE, all right? OSCE observers. So why are we talking about peacekeepers, which are these people, these boots on the grounds, which are like military personnel, as opposed to the kind of a bigger version of the previous arrangement that was supposed that not that was supposed that did monitor the Minsk agreements and that did continuously report on infringements. You don't need military on there as long as both sides are actually committed to keep what they're promising, and then you could have observers that just report on infringements.
Well, I agree with that. Again, I don't think there's any need for peacekeepers. And in fact, the supposedly leaked 100-day Trump peace plan, if indeed it's genuine, states that the question of peacekeepers won't be part of the peace agreement, but it will be a subject to further discussion down the road. So I think that's where it needs to be. Because Russia is their last statement is no foreign troops in Ukraine at all.
Right.
So yeah, international observers, that would be okay. Of course, Russia would love to have weapons inspectors to ensure Ukrainian disarmament. And I think, as I mentioned in my article, I think that is really going to end up being the main sticking point. I think Ukraine previously agreed under the Istanbul Agreement that was 90% completed, that they agreed to a 250,000 man cap for their armed forces. Russia's insisting at 85,000 to 100,000. But obviously, 880,000 or even the 350,000 Ukrainian troop level that I believe is the actual size of the Ukrainian army, that's not going to be acceptable to Russia. So we have to at least get down to within, the 250,000 range, I think, for them to agree and be comfortable with a framework agreement that should precede a ceasefire. But that would also, probably the most important concern on the Russian side, and really the reason they invaded Ukraine, was to restore Ukraine to, kind of a nuclear-free uh, buffer zone, essentially, that it was prior to becoming a de facto NATO member with the signing of the two strategic partnership agreements between the U.S. and Ukraine in August and November of 2021. Because their fear has really been that the U.S. at any time with Ukraine as essentially a U.S. satellite or vassal state could or military protectorate, we could deploy B-52 bombers to a Ukrainian airbase as little as 300 miles away from Moscow, and then, conduct a decapitation nuclear first strike against the Kremlin with 5 minutes warning. So that's really the key reason that they don't want Ukraine to be aligned with the U.S. militarily at all, and it's why their main focus has been to both decrease the number and also the ranges of Ukrainian strike systems, offensive strike systems that include combat. F-16s obviously are nuclear capable. They have ATACMS missiles. We've never deployed nuclear warheads on ATACMS missiles, but it would be very easy, I think, to do so. We have, obviously have warheads that are small enough to fit inside ATACMS missiles. So those types of systems need to be entirely eliminated, I would say.
Right, like that will be part of the demilitarization, going hand in hand with the troop strength cap. But one thing that goes through my mind is that if I was Russia, I would not only look at Ukraine in order to assess whether or not the USA and NATO, or the USA in NATO, is serious about the escalation. I would look at all the other places. I mean, Sweden and Finland now have 15 and 17 bases each. US bases, not NATO bases, US bases each. It's clear now that Ramstein in Germany is not going to be the biggest US military base anymore in Europe. It's going to be in Romania, right at the Black Sea, right? And that's also right at the doorsteps of Russia. Do you think that Donald Trump has any intentions of scaling any of that one back? Because yeah, I mean, Ukraine, the war is going in favor of the Russians, but the other rimlands now would look to me that still very scary, and that's a place where you could like signal serious effort to de-escalate.
Yeah, so President Trump has actually stated that he wants to reduce the U.S. military footprint in NATO by 20,000 troops. So 20,000 troops happens to be the exact number of troops that the U.S. has inside of Eastern Europe. So I thought that was very interesting. I think that Trump could very easily agree to Russia's request to withdraw all 20,000 troops from Eastern Europe. Because that's an exact match essentially for what Trump proposed. So, yeah, that seems very, very realistic. And as you may have noted in my proposal, I also list what I call a strategic framework agreement between the U.S. and Russia, or essentially a strategic partnership agreement. And that obviously includes no eastward expansion for NATO. It includes a withdrawal of those 20,000 troops from Eastern Europe. It also includes a withdrawal of U.S. nuclear weapons out, tactical nuclear weapons out of Western Europe to the Pacific region or wherever the heck Trump decides to send them. in exchange for reciprocal Russian reductions. And, essentially, I call it a conventional forces in Europe two treaty that I think would not only restore peace and security in Europe, but it would incorporate a few of the provisions of the Russian draft mutual security agreements that were submitted to the U.S. and NATO in December 2021. Many of the provisions of which I believe would be in NATO's and America's national security interest to accept.
I absolutely love the idea, and that's something that I would love to see come about, right? Mutual de-escalation. But there's one thing now that uh, to me speaks against this, or that stands in the way, which is on the one hand, President Trump has said he wants to be a president of peace, and I remember now his speech, right, saying like we will be measured, our success will be measured by the wars that we didn't, by the wars that we end and those that we didn't get into, which is a wonderful thing to say. But on the other hand, what he's doing right now with Mexico and Canada, basically declaring an emergency in order to overwrite the free trade agreement that he himself imposed after trashing the old free trade agreement back in what was it? I think it was 16, 17, right? Um, that sends a very clear signal, which is that anything goes, and these treaties are something that under the US are not only subject to review every new president, they're also subject to review within a president's, within the same president, even though it's like two terms. Yeah, sure, but um, and it's planning security is out of the window, I believe. How do you think the Russians will deal with that aspect of the United States? It's not just Trump, but the US as a continuous kind of partner there.
I've gotten this question repeatedly from a number of folks, including Russian media. And my answer is that the U.S. I think just like Russia, the U.S. Is highly unlikely to sign up to any terms that it's not generally willing to adhere to. And in the case of of the peace agreement that I've outlined, I think it's not only in Russia's national interest to adhere to, but it's also in the U.S. national security interest as well. And I think it's entirely in line with Trump's agenda. That he wants to kind of demilitarize to some extent the U.S. presence in Europe. He wants to focus more on what the Western Hemisphere, border security, homeland defense, building an Iron Dome, kind of a Reagan SDI, comprehensive national missile defense system. So he wants to reorient us from offensive power projection to other continents to really focusing on actual defense. Turning instead of right now we have essentially a Department of War. That's more offensively oriented, and we need to go back to having a true Department of Defense that is kind of focuses on the defense of the U.S. and its immediate neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. I've long called for a return for the U.S. from trying to be a global superpower to a hemispheric superpower, just as we were before World War II. A lot of people call that isolationism, but I call it, I call myself a regional hegemonist, and folks like you, I think, even would disagree with that. But at least it's progress, from not interfering in Eurasia and trying to, leave Russia and China alone while supporting our allies abroad, helping them defend themselves, encouraging them perhaps even to have, in the case of Germany or perhaps even Japan, their own nuclear arsenal so that the U.S. wouldn't be threatened to get into a nuclear war with Russia or China over countries half a world away. So that I think is consistent with the Trump agenda, and I look forward to seeing him implement that. But as we discussed, there is a wing of the Trump cabinet and administration that is still, has essentially they had their feet on both sides, one foot in the kind of in the globalist side, wanting to continue not necessarily primacy or global hegemony, but something kind of a watered down version of that, and then also trying to show support for President Trump's America First foreign policy realist agenda as well.